thank you all for being here. Taylor, I've learned something. I don't think it's the word economics in the title that got everybody here, or probably ecology. But actually, if you designed a really good experiment, so bar is definitely an option here, but saving the world is other, and I don't know which of these two pulled you all in, but maybe it's the combination. But in some sense, the combination is good because in dealing with these kinds of problems, it's not purely economics, it's not purely ecology. We actually do need to blend lots of approaches for thinking about what I'll call the challenge of sustainable development. And I'm gonna pitch this as sort of two interlocking or independent challenges. And Andrew did a really nice job of setting up some of the issues that I'm going to talk about. He talked about producing food, but also trying to safeguard biodiversity. And how do we do both? We only have one landscape. How do we think about those trade-offs? So I'm going to pitch this in terms of sustainability. So sustainable development can be thought about as sustainability and also as economic development. But we're doing things now to this planet that have consequences both for biodiversity and also potentially for future human well-being, our own species well-being. And so we need to be thinking about what we're doing and how can we safeguard both for biodiversity and for future generations of humans. But at the same time, we also do need development. There are many people on this planet who don't have much. So, 800 million people approximately are malnourished. So thinking back to the food issue that Andrew talked about. So how do we think about raising standards of living, but do this in a way which is consistent with sustainability? So the problem oftentimes, so I go back and forth between the world of economics and ecology. And when I'm with my economist friends, oftentimes they're thinking about strictly economic development. How do we raise people out of poverty? The problem with just thinking about that is that if we just focus on that and don't think about the natural capital or nature's part of this, we risk being unsustainable. When I'm over in conservation science or ecology, if we don't bring in the human component, basically we risk being irrelevant. So how do we actually satisfy both of these or bring these both together? I'm going to start from the following. So many of you may be aware of something called the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. It's now been out for about 10 years. What I liked about this was it tried to bring these together in a way. So humans are dependent upon nature, right? So ecosystems and biodiversity are essential for human well-being. One of the charts that came out of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment is the following. I don't care that you can read line by line, but hopefully you can see that there's lots of triangles pointing downward. So each line here is an important ecosystem service. In other words, an important thing of benefits that nature provides to people. And most of those arrows, disturbingly, were headed downward. In other words, the trend through time was negative. Okay, we're depleting natural capital. We're reducing the benefits, the life support system for human well-being. There are a few that go up, but most of them go down. Okay, why? Well, I'm going to put on my economics hat for a moment, and if we think about how much of the economic system is organized through markets and market behavior, markets are a very powerful set of incentives. They provide signals of value for some goods and services, but clearly not for all. They clearly don't provide a signal of value for things which are of great value, right? So the economics terms are called externalities and public goods, but just think about anything that nature provides you: clean air, clean water. Those don't go through markets. Markets don't provide a signal of their worth, and there aren't people taking actions to produce clean water like there are to produce commodities for which they get paid. So we're systematically ignoring the contributions of nature, and we systematically undervalue these ecosystem services. If I go back to that chart that I showed you, I just circled the ones that go up. Okay, all the other ones are flat or going down. And I'll read off the ones that are going up because there's a pattern here. So this is crops, livestock, aquaculture, and then carbon sequestration. The first three, crops, livestock, aquaculture, these are all commodities. People produce these, right? Farmers, ranchers. Actually, I don't know what you call aquaculturists, but anyway, the people who produce aquaculture. So, these are people, they're getting paid for their output. So it's not perhaps a surprise that those ecosystem services are doing well, but the vast bulk of the other ecosystem services that nobody gets paid for are declining. Okay, so we have a problem. And if we're going to make the challenge of sustainable development in the 21st century, we really have to change this. So I'm going to give you just one simple example of how to think through this issue. And then a last slide to think maybe about just to tease you with other examples. But the point here is we need to move fast on this. So there are the good news is there are some examples of how to do this, how to move economic systems or political systems. The bad news is, are we doing this fast enough? Okay, so I'm going to give you an example from the Willamette Basin in Oregon, where I used to live. And this just shows you kind of a map of the region and kind of the basic biogeography of the region. So you've got the valley floor in the middle, and you've got the Coast Range, a little sliver of it on one edge, and the Cascade Mountains on the other edge. The other map just shows the landscape pattern or the land cover. Okay, so forests up in the hills and the mountains, and agriculture primarily in the middle. And what we did was we looked at, we actually benefited by working with groups in the valley, in the basin, who had put together sort of future scenarios of land use. And they actually had maps for 3 different scenarios, one more business-oriented, one kind of business as usual, and one more conservation-oriented. And they had these maps from 1990 up to 2050. They were gracious enough to let us have the maps. And then what we did was we said, well, what are the consequences of these future land use plans in the basin? And we were interested in evaluating this on a number of ecosystem services or direct, what are the direct returns to landowners? So you can see there's 6 things that we tracked, including, how much phosphorus was going into the Willamette River, and how much erosion was there, and what was the flooding, how much carbon was sequestered, how were various species doing in the basin, and finally, how much return was there to landowners, either through agricultural crops or timber production or housing developments. Okay, and the 3 dots or the 3 lines here are showing you under these different scenarios, the more conservation-oriented scenario, business as usual, more development-oriented scenario, what happens to these various things that we care about from the landscape. Now, that's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is to kind of try to summarize it into trade-offs. And Andrew talked about trade-offs. We want to produce food, but we also want to have biodiversity. How are we going to do this? So here are 3 options of how we can have land use in the Willamette Basin. And it gives us trade-offs among these various different things that I showed you on the last slide. The circles on the left are kind of the classic way of looking at this. So if we think about on the horizontal axis is the returns to landowners, so the economic value or market value, and the vertical axis is how well is biodiversity doing. And you can see our 3 scenarios. So the green one, the conservation scenario, does well for biodiversity, but doesn't do as well for the market returns to landowners, right? And the other 2 do much better in terms of market returns, but less in biodiversity. So classic trade-off here, right? So looks like you can't, it's one or the other. If you look at the triangles on the right, now the only thing that we did differently here was we said, what if we could actually value one of the ecosystem services? Not all of them, but just carbon. So what if we could pay landowners, for example, for sequestering carbon, recognizing the value that they're contributing to larger society? When you do that, now you get the triangles on the right. It's no longer a classic trade-off, right? You get better, the green triangle is better both in terms of biodiversity as well as the returns to society. And this represents a fairly basic point to me, is like, if you don't have your metrics right, if people are responding to the wrong set of signals, they're going to make decisions which may be bad both for nature and for people, right? So we need to get this right. Now, there are a number of ways that you can do this, and we might talk about some of them. Hopefully you'll ask us about some of these. This can be policy mechanism, changes in the rules. Here it was a simple change in the rules, like what if we could establish a carbon market, either through a carbon price or a cap and trade system or something like that. But there are other ways that one can do this as well. But I want to give you some examples of where things actually are moving now in really trying to address this problem. So one place I've been fortunate enough to work over the last few years is in China. And somewhat surprisingly, especially if you think about the air pollution that you see in Beijing and other Chinese cities, they've actually had a very aggressive program of payments for ecosystem services. The largest conservation program in the world, the Sloping Lands Conversion Program. They're now thinking about doing something that they call gross ecosystem product. So we all know that GDP, or gross domestic product, is kind of a basic economic measure. Well, can we produce something which captures this notion of how is nature doing, how are the ecosystem services or natural capital doing, and make leaders of provinces responsible not just for GDP, but also GEP, right? So changing the set of metrics, changing what society rewards. In Latin America, there's been an example of paying landowners upstream to do things which produce clean water downstream. So downstream water users paying upstream landowners to preserve clean water. It's called water funds, and it's spread to more than 40 watersheds, cities in Latin America. And even in the US, we actually are doing quite a few things. So Office of Management and Budget, just earlier this month, released guidance on ecosystem services to the other parts of the agencies in the federal government to say, here's guidance for how you need to incorporate ecosystem services and natural capital into your planning and your policy. And there are examples also of existing programs, Conservation Reserve Program, Wetlands Reserve Program, and others. There's examples in the private sector, which I won't go into now, but there are a number of places now where we actually are moving to try to do this. But as I say, I think the race is on. We're doing, if we updated that Millennium Ecosystem Assessment and looked at how the trend in ecosystem services is, I don't think we would have changed it too much. I think most of the trends that we saw as of 10 years ago are continuing. So how can we ramp this up and speed this up and actually get those things turned around and conserve nature, both for nature's sake as well as our own? Thanks very much.